I've titled it Hedgehogs in High Places because there's a bit of a mountain, an alpine aspect to it, but also mostly because hedgehogs are really high on our priorities of things to learn more about and to control better. So I'm not sure how everyone is placed on hedgehog control, but that when people think of predators, it's usually the stoats, rats, and possums. But in the ecosystems we work in, hedgehogs are one of the most impactful predators, if not the worst. So basically, we've put a lot of effort into learning more about hedgehogs, and I'm going to talk about just what we've learnt today and how that's going to feed into our trial to get rid of them. So am I right to start clicking through, Nick?
Yeah, away you go.
Yep, cool. So hedgehogs impact a lot of these really important biodiversity values that we're trying to protect. Birds are kind of the obvious ones to go to sort of demonstrate how bad they are. These pictures kind of sum it up for me. These are tarapuka nests or black-billed gulls, and they're the most endangered gull species in the world, and hedgehogs are responsible for a really big proportion of their nest predation. So up to 90% of braided river birds are eaten alive, or their eggs are eaten by hedgehogs. Here's another picture of a banded dotterel, incubating its eggs, and the same frame of a hedgehog, raiding its nest the following night. So they're really such a big concern for us that this is why we're putting all of this effort into learning more about them. And that's not to speak of all of the the untold number of invertebrates and reptiles that hedgehogs predate upon. So I hope that's gotten people who don't really know too much about the impacts of hedgehogs up to speed, which will kind of set us up to talk more about them. They're also incredibly abundant in these dryland environments. So this is a bit of an old graphic now, but I think we're up to 10,000 predator captures, and still hedgehogs are more than half of those. So just incredibly numerous, and putting a really big pressure onto our native biodiversity. So for the last, I should say, this is where they're caught too. This is the Tamanahuna Aoraki predator network. So all of these captures are sort of occurring around these braided rivers and dryland ecosystems that we're trying to protect. And the ultimate goal of Tamanahuna Aoraki is to remove hedgehogs out of all of these intermontane valleys and sort of get them back to a point where we can hold these areas and allow these species to recover. So for the last 3 years, myself and many others have put in quite a lot of effort into learning more about hedgehogs. And so I'm just going to spend most of my time today talking about what we've learned and kind of describing how these things kind of feed into our efforts to remove hedgehogs in these environments. So the first thing that I set out to do was learn more about the distribution of hedgehogs. I did this with a camera trap survey. So on that plot to the left, all of those pins are just a wildlife camera. And I did this across about 180 sites all throughout the Mackenzie Basin. So that plot on the right's where all of the cameras were. These were from 500 meters, so at about lake level, all the way up to 2,300 meters, so where you start to find permanent snow. And I did this through summertime, so the peak of summer, the warmest temperatures, and the lowest period of snow cover to kind of capture the maximum distribution of hedgehogs and all of the other pest species that occur in this area. And this is the sort of thing that you get out of it. You don't get much for your effort, but basically this is kind of new information about where hedgehogs can be found. So that plot on the left, that shows us that the probability of a hedgehog occurring at a site decreases with elevation. So, at lake level at 500 meters, there's, about an 80% chance of a hedgehog being at a site if you were to put out a camera. Whereas all the way up at 2,000 meters, there's, a very small chance, but not zero chances of a hedgehog being there. The center plot and the plot on the right are kind of a little bit more difficult to explain. The middle one's just vegetation productivity, and the right-hand side one is habitat type. So without getting too far into the weeds of occupancy modeling and stuff, this is the kind of information that we use to build like a distribution plot, like what's on your screen now. So this is essentially a heat map of where hedgehogs are likely to occur. So black or dark blue being really low probability of a hedgehog occurring, and really bright yellow being almost certain to occur. And we can use this for a lot of different things. We can kind of work out the areas that we need to trap, where hedgehogs are most likely to occur and where we can detect them the best. And where hedgehogs are likely to put the most predation pressure on the things that we're trying to protect. Another application of this kind of distribution mapping is working out what landscape features will actually prevent hedgehogs from moving. So kind of looking for defendable areas. Phil Bell, he spoke in a previous webinar about landscape barriers. And one of these landscape barriers that we've been looking at are mountains. So high elevation landforms that have a lot of scree, not a lot of vegetation, and a lot of steep-sided mountains. So this is kind of telling us that there's a pretty good probability of hedgehogs being within this landscape feature, and these like high elevation landforms on either side are kind of really low probability of hedgehogs being there. So with predictions like this, we can kind of look at a landscape and say, ask how defendable it is. Without actually testing this, it's just a pretty picture. So we've been using these little GPS tags. So that's on the right-hand side of your screen. These are really cheap to make. They work out to be about $380 a piece. And I've been putting these on the backs of hedgehogs. So you just trim the spines, make a little flat spot, and attach it with some glue. And the hedgehog will just, kind of waddle around with it on its back. It's not like a collar that you need to constantly be checking and, worried that it's really affecting the animal. Hedgehogs can carry transmitters like this, and they'll naturally shed them. So they're really like an ideal animal to work with in this sense. So I went out and I caught as many hedgehogs as I could in this area to test these predictions, and they did actually kind of confirm what we were thinking. So you're looking at the data of about 8 hedgehogs across a 6-month period through summer, and not one of them were sort of left these areas that we predicted that they would be kind of constrained in. But you can see on the right-hand side of that plot, there's a low saddle where there's a moderate or that pinky kind of color, a probability of a hedgehog being there. So, and this is, what the tracks of hedgehogs in this area look like. So we're kind of building confidence around what areas are defendable, what areas are vulnerable to reinvasion, and this is really guiding our thinking about how well is the Tamanahuna Aoraki project defended from invasion from the outside, but also how are we going to divide up this landscape and strategize about which blocks need to go first, which blocks are kind of really open and would be last, which blocks need to go before others so that they kind of defend themselves in a way. When you've got no hedgehogs in the next valley over, then you don't need to defend against them, that kind of thing. So this has been really useful in our planning, and we've kind of done this for all species too. This is obviously really handy to have GPS data for hedgehogs, but we've also checked it out for a few other species too, which has been really useful for us. This same GPS technology has been used to kind of tell us a few other things about how hedgehogs are moving in the landscape. So this is the data from one hedgehog that you're looking at, and we found that at no point through the summer this hedgehog crossed a stream. You know, it was only about 1 meter across, and yet while it would not be considered as a barrier to a hedgehog, they're pretty good swimmers. You know, that this is a really significant thing to factor into how we target hedgehogs. No amount of traps on that right-hand side of the valley or cameras were going to pick up or trap this hedgehog. And so this is kind of one of the things that we're building into how we target them. We've also used GPS data for learning more about hedgehog home range. So that plot on the left is a female, and the plot on the right is a male. So really big differences, and this is, you know, guiding how we think about trap density and trap position. One of the things that we were really interested to learn was if we can refine the area that we need to target for hedgehogs. So the Tamanahuna Aoraki project is a massive, you know, it's more than 300,000 hectares. And so any way that we can refine that area by only targeting like the minimum adequate population of hedgehogs would be of great interest. So, you know, a really big saving. So we thought that, well, we wondered if hedgehogs that occur in the high elevation zone are actually, you know, if they're just visitors through summertime, or if there are actual, you know, high elevation hedgehogs that live in these areas all through the year. Hedgehogs are a migratory species, but they do exploit food patches when they become temporarily available in the landscape. So we thought there was a chance that hedgehogs could potentially be, you know, only making a movement maybe of 400 or 500 meters downhill, but that would effectively be putting them in a different bioclimatic zone. So, you know, they would only need to hibernate through a shorter period. They would have a longer period that they can forage and breed and gain resources and put on fat through summertime for hibernation. So, you know, doing so would give them a really big advantage ecologically. So I spent one summer, and I've done it again this past summer, going out and catching as many hedgehogs as I could, as high as I could find them. They're quite thin on the ground up high, so it did take some doing, but I did get a sample in the end. And I you know, really frequently went and exchanged these GPS devices and built up my knowledge about what areas these hedgehogs were using and at what altitude that they were occurring, from about January to June in the end. And basically I found that although they did vary in what elevation they used through their active period, they stayed in the same areas that they used through summer. So they showed no evidence of getting out of these high elevation areas. So that polygon on the right-hand side of this plot is snow. So there's, you know, really strong environmental cues that if a hedgehog were to sort of abandon their home range in high elevation areas, that would be the time to do it. But all of my study animals stayed up really high. These are all above 1,500 meters. And the last one that I checked was in June. And when I returned to the field, this was after the COVID lockdown, so it was pretty exciting to get outside again and see where all of my hedgehogs had turned up. All of them were under snow pretty much and happily hibernating away. I should say, though, that plot on the left-hand side, that little insert, is one that was actually killed in an avalanche, and that's a little bit irrelevant, but I thought it was interesting. It might be the first hedgehog fatality due to an avalanche in New Zealand. Even the hedgehogs that weren't under snow were hibernating away. So this is me looking rather pleased with the catch of the season. This is one of the biggest nests that I'd found. And hedgehogs above, 1,200 meters were all in these nests. They sort of weave them out of tussocks, and they stay relatively dry. They're just tucked under a tussock. And all hedgehogs that I studied were in this zone. So basically the outcome of this study was that there is no saving. We need to be targeting hedgehogs where they occur through summer. But on the flip side of that, it means that populations are more stable. So when we talk about defending a landscape, it would actually be a little bit concerning if every year we had this march of hedgehogs, hitting, sort of breaking over the rocks, and testing out all of these weak points. But as we understand it now, hedgehogs that occur in these areas are much more stable. They have established home ranges, and they're not making any dramatic movements. So from a defendability point of view, that's actually an advantage. One thing that did arise from their hibernation was that it was really interesting to see at what point they started to hibernate. So this has some pretty big implications for how we detect and how we target hedgehogs actively. So using things like detection dogs and thermal imaging, that sort of thing. It's, people in the North Island don't really have to worry about this because hedgehogs they're active all year long, just about. But in the South Island, and especially in the Southern Alps, there's, at any point of the year, you can have these really cold temperatures. Hedgehogs are sort of pretty sensitive to this. There's a known limit where below 10 degrees, hedgehogs will start to hibernate. But this is a little bit, just a rule of thumb. No one had really looked at this. So what we did was we put these little temperature loggers out in the landscape, all around where we were catching hedgehogs, and we matched temperatures up to how active hedgehogs were. So by measure of the proportion that of the night that they spent foraging, and also the distance that they moved. These are a little bit preliminary, and I'm sorry about the figure titles, but what we found was that 10-degree rule was more or less right, but you could expect activity, down to the 0-degree mark. And that temperature scale on the x-axis, I should say, this is the mean temperature throughout the night. So this is really helpful for us because we know when we go out to either target hedgehogs to look for survivors, or to put out cameras to try and detect them, to sort of get a measure of how their densities are, we need to be thinking about temperature. And so only nights where, if we were to say 10 degrees, only nights where the mean temperature was above 10 degrees kind of represent 100% activity for hedgehogs. And anything below that, you'll still get hedgehogs, but what you're seeing is a reduced activity of hedgehogs. The kind of like spatial predictions of hedgehogs have allowed us to rule out a lot of terrain as well. So this is the upper part of the Mistake Valley, and while there are several little patches of habitat that would potentially be usable by hedgehogs, they're segregated by these really big scree slopes and quite a lot of distance of really poor habitat. So we wondered if this was actually, if we needed to factor these in for controlling hedgehogs. And so we put traps out in all of these areas, and aside from catching a few stoats, this is really, there's no hedgehogs at all so far as we know. We're going to put a little bit more effort into it this season, but it looks like we can, potentially rule out needing to trap areas like this. In similar patches of habitat on the valley walls, we wondered if the hedgehogs that we're detecting in these areas are, if they're coming down to the valley floor. And so could we potentially not need to put traps out or other control measures into these, steep-sided patches of habitat. And what you're seeing on their screen is just the tracks of two hedgehogs. And while they did occur on these steep slopes, they spent 80% of their time on the valley floor. So why would you extend your trap array over these patches of habitat that are really hard to access, that are actually quite dangerous for field workers to be in, if you can eventually get these hedgehogs on the valley floor with traps. Movements are also useful for fine scale adjustments of where you put your traps. So this is the data of two males, and we were able to follow their tracks and to work out what landscape features they actually move around in. And we found that there's pretty clear use of ridgelines and that sort of thing, like a lot of other animals use, paths of least resistance, and avoiding these big landscape features like that bluff you can see in the center of the image. So when we're looking at setting out a grid of traps, and this is not going to be news to many trapping community trapping groups out there, but having a little bit of flexibility about where that trap goes and to the point where it's most likely to encounter a hedgehog. And we've also used this data to work out how hedgehogs are interacting with our traps. So the plot on the right-hand side is the data of about 3 hedgehogs, and the yellow dots are where our traps are. So we can say with a lot of confidence that not trapping these hedgehogs is not for a lack of spatial coverage. Our problem will come down to a lack of interaction, a lack of hedgehogs interacting with our devices. And this really lit a fire under us because what you're seeing are 3 uncaught hedgehogs, despite how many traps are out within their home ranges. So this tells us that we've got to do a lot better to improve that interaction and get hedgehogs into traps. What traps we use are also dictated by what other species that we could potentially be putting at risk with traps. One of those species in the area that we're working in are kea. We've used our cameras in the same way that we've used them to look at pest interactions and their distribution, to look at where keas are, let's say, interacting with our cameras. That plot on the right, if you can see those little numbers next to each point, represent a degree or an index of interaction by kea. So I've just crudely drawn a red line around those, but even though the Mistake Valley is kind of separated by some distance from those kea risk zones, we still have to be factoring in what traps we use. Sorry, it just froze. So yeah, it's not like we can take off the ends of our traps and expect hedgehogs to be caught without putting kea at risk. Or maybe this is enough effort put into working out where kea are and what risk we're putting kea at risk, sorry, I should say. So finally, this is the Mistake Valley. It's representative of a lot of the landforms that we have in the Mackenzie Basin because it has these really tall mountain ranges that we think are good defense against hedgehogs, but also several low areas that are kind of more vulnerable. The valley floor is at about 1,200 meters, which, because hedgehog occupancy decreases with elevation, it's kind of like we're dealing with a lower density population of hedgehogs. So it's actually kind of helpful that we can get to that knockdown, get through that knockdown phase a little bit quicker, and we can start to troubleshoot getting those last few hedgehogs. At present, we've rolled out about 2,500 hectares, and this summer it's going to be extended down the valley to be a total of 5,500 hectares. And although last summer was mostly a setup phase, we did run the trapping for a few months, and we have caught quite a few more hedgehogs than we anticipated. And all of those captures kind of occurred where we were expecting them. It's probably of interest as well, as we caught more than twice the amount of stoats. Then we caught twice as many stoats than we did hedgehogs. So down on the flats, it's typical for hedgehogs to kind of clog up trapping networks. But in this environment, it was flipped around the other way, where we couldn't seem to clear traps fast enough and have them available to catch hedgehogs. So that was a little bit novel. So to summarize those findings, we've used a lot of the distribution information and their fine scale kind of movement and ruling out different habitat to dramatically decrease where we actually need to put traps in this environment. So if we were to put out a grid of 125 meter spaced double set Dock 150 traps all the way across the 2,500 hectares, we would need about 1,600 traps. But because we've kind of got this new information, we've managed to decrease that down to 280 traps. So some of that's a real no-brainer. You don't put traps out on scree slopes, but a lot of that's actually looking at a landscape and knowing where hedgehogs are using and not using, or are using but also using other landscape features. And that's where we've sort of got these savings from. So 125 meter spacings might seem quite tight. This is a density that other trapping eradication groups have used around the world. And it's worth saying that even at this density, just trapping does not get rid of hedgehogs alone. So all of these programs have used dogs and thermals and going out at night with a lot of people and torches and that sort of thing. We've learnt that the landscape features like the Mistake Valley they do defend an area. It's not a completely defended area, but it is defendable in that we know which landscape features are likely to leak. We know and understand where the weak points are, and we know where we probably don't need to expect reinvasion from hedgehogs. We have learnt really refined where and when we need to look for hedgehogs. So based on habitat use and also kind of like setting those temperature parameters as well, in which we sort of need to be working to make sure we're getting a good, how we measure hedgehogs is accurate. We're using our GPS devices on hedgehogs to kind of troubleshoot those interactions, and we're using information about the species that we could potentially be putting at risk with traps to guide how we target hedgehogs. So I hope that is of use to anybody who's targeting hedgehogs around the country. If not, I hope that it kind of, gets some thinking happening about what we can learn about the pest species that are using the particular environment that you're in to increase your chances of success. So I'll pass it over to you, Nick. I've seen a few questions come through.
Thanks, Nick. That was brilliant. Absolutely. What a beautiful part of the country you do your job in. That must be one of the benefits of working there.
Yeah, it's a perk, that's for sure.
I'm just going to put you across to this bigger screen so we can see you. And hold on, here it comes. There we go. Got quite a few questions I'm just going to flick to you. So rapid questions, rapid answer time, if that's all right with you, and certainly have a drink. Just wanted to start off with, have you made any modifications to traps or baffles to make them more effective for hedgehogs?
Yes. So the Dock 150s came with 60mm by 60mm entrances, and we enlarged them to 80 by 80, or is that 4 mesh squares? We use the metal plates. So we've enlarged that to the limit that we know that Kia can get in when it's a little bit bigger than that. And we've also shortened the baffle length a little bit, just to make it a little bit easier for hedgehogs to get through. And also, I don't know if this is something that a lot of trapping groups sort of noticed, that if the baffle is too narrow, hedgehogs also can't sort of take a full step onto the treadle, and that's when you start to get these inhumane kills where a trap will just close on a hedgehog's nose. So we sort of decrease the baffle size for kind of a humane reason. But yeah, 80 by 80 was what we're using.
And bait, what's your recommendation for baits? What worked for you?
Well, bait's one of the things that we haven't changed too much. We started off using raw rabbit, so just a standard Doc 150 piece of fresh rabbit. These seem to work really well, but they in summer in the Mackenzie Basin they just absolutely bake, and they become pieces of rabbit jerky in just a few days. So if we wanted to keep these traps out for 2 or 3 weeks, we needed a lure that was going to remain attractive, even if it wasn't as attractive as a piece of a raw rabbit. So we switched to arrays, and just by putting a little bit of like a dab of mayonnaise on top of the arrays, just to sort of loosen it up a little bit and make it maybe a little bit more volatile in terms of scent.
Did you dissect any of their gut areas to be able to find out what they had been eating?
I've never dissected a hedgehog actually, but I have spent the last 3 summers collecting their scats. So I'm not going to look at these personally, but these are going to be used potentially for eDNA, so we can actually learn what species are being guzzled up by hedgehogs. At the moment, these are just in cold storage, but yeah, it would be really useful for working out which species are getting smashed by hedgehogs, and also which the same species would be able to use to kind of measure. So if we're looking for a response in the biodiversity values that we want to protect, knowing which species are hit hard by hedgehogs is really useful for us in measuring response in biodiversity.
A question from me, I wonder, when having a conversation about hedgehogs, and you obviously come across people that don't even know that they're a predator or a pest in this country, how do you start that conversation without being a bit too full on in the first sentence? So how do you get the discussion going? Have you got any tips?
I usually confess to saying they are really cute. And just kind of look at what they're doing in the environment. So they are insectivores, and they are incredibly good hunters. They use smelling to find their meals, and just about, I don't know how I would approach it to kind of get over the cute factor, but I find that talking about things that are cuter, like birds and little chicks of dotterels or tuturi fatu, that they're eaten alive by hedgehogs, and all of a sudden hedgehogs, the sheen comes off a little bit, I find.
Yeah, just slow and steady, really, getting the information out slow and steady.
Yeah, yep. I think there's a lot of, especially this year and last year, there's been a lot of hedgehog stuff in the news, just mostly telling the same story, like, these really cute animals are actually really bad for New Zealand's biodiversity. So I think it's becoming more and more out there.
A question we got was, can they climb netting rabbit fences?
We think so. This is something we're going to be looking at this summer, or at least other people in the Mackenzie Basin. There are all of these rabbit-proof fences in the basin, so it'd be really interesting for us to know if these are stopping hedgehogs moving, or if they're not, what we would need to do to them to stop them from, whether that's a metal plate or a coping or something like that. What would we need to modify to make these existing structures, just that little bit better and effective for hedgehogs? So yeah, sorry, I can't answer if they can climb meshing, but I would put a pretty penny on it that they could. They can. Some people have written about how they can climb trees to eat fruits and that sort of thing. There's some pretty convincing YouTube videos of hedgehogs climbing out of pens, that sort of thing. So I would say yes.
Angela asked, why were they introduced into New Zealand in the first place? Fairly basic question, which is good.
Yeah, they were introduced to New Zealand just as a memento of home for British settlers. So I think this is my understanding of it. When people arrived, there was maybe some disappointment that New Zealand wasn't the paradise that was promised to people. So there were these societies that looked to make New Zealand a nicer place for the settlers. And one of the things they did amongst, bringing in a lot of the trees and plants and stuff, were hedgehogs. Hedgehogs is this cute animal that they can see around their gardens. To a lesser degree, they thought that hedgehogs would control some pests in the garden, but I think it was mostly for sentimental reasons.
One of our people have asked, it's a question that's got a few different parts to it, but just asking, what can inner city schools do to support the program? Are there resources available, data to analyse, interpret, opportunities for students to be involved in some ways? She's probably asking, how does she get into this with students in a urban area? What would be your advice?
Well, there's always the opportunity to start a community trapping group. Excuse me.
That's fun.
If people are noticing hedgehogs in their areas, perhaps get in contact with a community trapping group, and seeing if they would like to expand, or if they need some more help checking traps, or if they have backyards that they see hedgehogs in, perhaps they could have their own trap that they look after and contribute in that way, because hedgehogs are definitely in urban New Zealand, that's for sure.
Mark Roper asks, can you make available the GIS tracker build info or parts list?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know how I'll get that information.
Well, they could email you. So why don't you, a good time to give out your email to anybody who wants to make contact, if you would.
Yeah, sure. Do you want me to just type that into the?
Yeah, put that in on the chat area and say it at the same time, because this is being recorded, everybody. So you can always go back and watch it again if you missed anything, or you want to pass this presentation on to other people that didn't see it today. And can I just say, everybody, we've done really well. There are an awful lot of you watching this, which is fantastic. Lockdown, of course, is a captured audience, but it's really nice to have you here. Somebody did ask about trimming the spines when you put on the trackers, and if that hurts a hedgehog.
That's a good question. No, it doesn't. So spines are made out of keratin, I think is the word. It's the same material as your fingernails. So it's trimming a hedgehog spine is the same sensation to them as clipping your nails. The only thing that you could potentially injure a hedgehog doing this is getting glue on its skin. So you've got to pay a lot of attention to how you use your glue. But other than that, I'm sure they don't like carrying a backpack, but trimming the spine's totally okay.
Any evidence that they climb trees and hunt birds up there?
Climb trees, they may do in exceptional circumstances, but they're not raiding the nests of our New Zealand birds, so far as we know. Yeah, they're mostly, when they're impacting birds, it's these ground nesting birds like the braided river species. Yeah.
And how often do they breed, and what size litters do they have?
They breed, I think they can have 2 litters in places with mild climates where their summer season is wider. But so far as we know in the South Island, it's just one litter per season. And litter size, I think typically the average is 3 to 4. I think they can have a little bit more, but yeah, in my study area anyway, I've only ever found 2 to 4 hedgehogs per litter.
And when you put the trackers on, did you expect for particularly the males to be able to travel as far? Their range was as big as you found?
Yeah, no, I didn't think the males would get around as much as they have. Um, in some exceptional nights where it's been really warm and like perfect weather, maybe they're looking for a mate as well. Some males have moved up to 6 kilometers in a night, which is pretty. That's a lot of distance for a little animal to cover. So yeah, I
Mm.
was quite surprised at how much area that they can cover.
We got somebody in Waikanae just asked if the habits of hedgehogs are likely to change in sand dunes.
Uh, I have no idea. Sorry, I can speculate that no, they would. Uh, they might not move around as far, just maybe because sand is a little bit harder or looser of a substrate to be walking around on. But yeah, I have no idea. I'm sorry.
It's fine. And another question that relates to a Wellingtonian question. Just we had quite a mild winter, and so therefore this person saying they saw more around. Do you think the effects of climate change could change the territories of hedgehogs throughout this country?
Not the territories, but if it's warming increasingly, then hedgehogs are going to be hibernating for less of the year, and so the period which they are putting pressure on our biodiversity will lengthen. So the pressure itself will become greater. I don't think their territories will change too much. They're already, at the limits of the vegetation line in the alpine zone. But perhaps if it's milder and winters are shorter, then they're going to be having a lower mortality rate, and so they may become more abundant in the alpine zone, which is a bit of a concern. So yeah, the main mortality of juvenile hedgehogs is overwintering. So they don't gain enough resources through the summer to survive overwintering. With climate change, they'll probably have an opportunity to get more resources, so and survive a shorter period too. So yeah, it's not good news, I'm afraid.
No, no. Trap sizes, 150s over .200s. Any reason for?
Yes, there is a reason. We use double set traps, so 2 opportunities to catch an animal instead of 1 at a point. If you have a DOC 200 or a DOC 250, the impact that a slamming 200 or 250 will often cause the other trap to trigger. So 150s are less likely to do this. So less problem with these like simultaneous trigger events.
Right. You're doing well. You answer the questions quicker than I can find them.
That's okay.
Just the question that somebody asked me to ask a question about cats. Did you also pull out any info on cat distribution in the study area from your trail cam monitor? Any cats come into the mix?
Yep. So in total, we've been studying 10 species, and for all of them, we've built these distribution maps, and we've looked at what landforms look to obstruct the movements of which species, and also with the really strong effect of winter, which species are getting out of these alpine zones and just going to lower areas through winter. So, yep, cats are one of those. And there has been some actual GPS tracking of cats in the past as well. So we've got a pretty good understanding of how they move through the landscape. That, along with hedgehogs and probably stoats, I think they're the top 3 predators of interest in our area.
That's it, Nick. There's a few extra little questions coming in, and some of them are similar to the ones we had earlier. There'll be other questions people might have for you that are specific for the areas they work in, or maybe some more tips, or just maybe some more ideas. And you're fine, obviously, for them to contact you. Can you just let us know your email again?
Yep. So I wrote it in the chat if people in here want to go up, but for those who can't see the chat, it's nicholas.foster@postgrad.otago.ac.nz.
Fantastic. Hey, we thank you heaps. What's the next projects then for you? How much more time are you going to put into these hedgehogs? Is this your thing now? You're going to just stick with hedgehogs?
No, hedgehogs are just one of the species that we're sort of studying in a little bit closer detail. So this summer we have 3 eradication trials. So the mistake is just one of them. We're working in the multi-brun range, which is nestled right up against the main divide, and we're working out how to get rid of stoats and hares and cats and possums out of this zone. And there's also another site down on the flats where we're trying to get rid of hedgehogs, ferrets, and rabbits. So a few different eradication trials, mainly about testing different tools and testing different densities and that sort of thing. So yeah, there's a lot more work to be done.
And with lockdown, of course, you can't go anywhere near your workplace, can you? So what's on your mind? You're thinking that you have traps that are full, I suppose, like so many people that are in this trapping, doing trapping and can't get to the places that they've worked so hard for.
Yeah, certainly in the lowland areas, but at least with the alpine work, that doesn't sort of kick off for another month or two. So we do have a little bit more grace before we really need to get stuck into it. But yeah, we need to be getting back into it soon. So fingers crossed that things change for the better and we're able to get out there again.
It's great. Somebody's just asked, can you follow your work on Instagram or Facebook? Can they do that?
The best account to follow is probably the Tamanahuna Aoraki Facebook page. They put posts and updates up, several times a week. So if you want information about all of the projects we're doing, I'd say that's the best one to go for. Yeah.
Wonderful. Nick, thanks so much. It's been great to have you on today, and we had a really big turnout and people obviously liking what you have said by all the emojis that came up and are still coming up, like, big hearts and lots of thumbs up. So you did a great job. I hope it inspires you to keep on cranking.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for all of the feedback and questions.